Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes for people to log in, and then we'll get started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this panel discussion. So the topic of today's discussion is, the title of it is Excelling in a Hyper-Competitive Labor Market, Sourcing, Engagement, and Retention. And so I just want to first level set. I think we're all HR leaders across the globe have experienced the fact that talent is in a turbulent market right now. We're all struggling to find the right talent. Is the one piece, and then actually retaining that talent is the second piece. We've seen different industries, the talent market goes up, goes down. Right now, there's a lot of turbulence within the tech industry. We've all seen that. We've heard about that. But still, regardless of the industry that we're in, our continual goal is to make sure that we're hiring the right talent at the right time. And so the question is always, how do we get that talent? How do we attract that talent? How do we get them into the door? And then how do we keep them for whatever period of time we need to keep them or they want to stay? And so today's discussion and the questions are really going to be focused on the different ideas, the different solutions, unique or not, that we all have either experienced or we're thinking about experiencing or implementing within our respective organizations. So with that said, I wanted to jump into the first question, which is really about the fact that we are all leveraging different types of technology. We're all leveraging different types of solutions. We got applicant tracking systems, professional organizations, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. Artificial intelligence is about to take over the world, as we all know. And so the question really that I want to talk about is, what sort of different or outside of the box angles have you all taken to really zeroing in on that problem, that challenge that we're all facing about recruitment and retention? And so I'd like to start with Mark.
Sure. When I got here a little over 5 years ago, being in healthcare, new to healthcare, I should say, a little over 5 years ago, it became very clear to me that all the different healthcare organizations were really just, taking from each other, recruiting from each other, and they weren't really solving the problem of filling those gaps. So we really took a long-term strategy and focused on building our talent pipelines across the organization. We started with nursing, and then we have moved into other areas. But part of that is partnering with local high school. We have a program now that they start in ninth grade, and throughout their 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade years, they take college level courses. When they graduate with 30 to 40 college level credits that are all healthcare prerequisites. Right now, we have 24 students that are seniors. They're going to be graduating, which is awesome. And they all have between 30 and 40 credits at the college level. So where our focus has been is getting them into the organization, letting them shadow here as a partner, letting them see what they like, what they don't like, all the while they're going through this coursework. Next in that step for us, as the partner, as the healthcare partner, is to get them into programs and help fund those programs. So we have an enhanced RN tuition program. We have medical imaging programs, up to $10,000 a year towards these different programs that we can then leverage with these students. They just need to work with us part-time. They don't need to work with us full-time. And what that does is allows them to focus on the financial, or focus on the school aspect of it and not have to focus on the financial aspect. We anticipate that through this program this year with the 24, we'll probably see anywhere from 8 to 10 nurses, which for us is a good number. We probably hire 20 GNs a year In 2 years, they're going to graduate from a local program that's completely paid for. In 2 years, they're probably going to be starting rates around somewhere around $35. We'll just say mid 30s for these nurses, and they're not going to have any college debt. They're going to be making, when you do the math on an annual basis, probably with overtime, 80,000 plus a year at 20 years old. So we really have just created this holistic approach. Now, it's a long-term process, right? I said long-term strategy. They're now seniors. We're 4 years into this, 2 years until we start seeing the fruits of that labor. But for us, it's a zero cost on the front end because it's all grant funded. So that's sort of where our thinking has gone. And the idea that these kids will stay in the community and help build in the community, be a part of the community. So there's just a nice holistic approach with the entire community.
I love that idea of basically homegrown. You use the phrase talent pipelining, but basically you're homegrowing your next generation of employees.
Yep.
And so that's very interesting. It's very good. I think one of the things that I've experienced with that is the education system or the educational programs have not kept up with what we need in terms of skills. That's a whole different topic of discussion, but I think the more influence we can have on these educational programs as we build partnerships with the schools, the better off we'll all be in the long run. Our organizations will be in the long run.
Agree 100%.
Dana, you came off mic, so you wanna chime in?
Sure, I'll chime in. Along the same lines, I mean, I do like the grow from within approach. Being and I lead global talent acquisition for Jamf, a technology company. In tech, it's equally as competitive to get talent, especially when you're talking about in the engineering world. So we actually do a couple of similar things. We do a Code to College program locally in Minnesota with high school kids. But one of the other things we do that not only I think helps build the pipeline, but really serves as an attraction to prospects is we have a Matter Innovation Hub. And that's actually work that we do in partnership with some other organizations. But in Zimbabwe, we provide Apple devices and we introduce technology to underprivileged kids there and provide them the experience to learn. And they are, we're setting up an EOR so that we can actually employ these individuals and bring them on into entry-level technology roles following the work that they do. This is not only building from within, but this is a huge attractor to getting tech talent that sees not only, at the early levels, but even seeing what we're giving back. A lot of what we do at Jamf is we have a great foundation that gives back. We have volunteer hours, and then we're doing this type of work, which is when my recruiting team talks to prospects about this is one of those intrinsic values and intrinsic, kind of benefits of joining an organization. So it's kind of twofold. It does help attract talent, in the tech area, just based on some of the things that, post-pandemic are more important to people right now than just salary and, benefits. It's like, what are you doing to give back and what are you doing to help the next generation?
Interesting. Thank you. Josh, you want to add anything?
Sure. So I'm Joshua Mitchell from Regeneron, a global pharmaceutical company, and I help lead talent experience and workforce planning. And I think I would say yes and to what everyone said here. The way I think about this is we intentionally created a strategy that was united under a mission to create enthusiastic relationships with talent, not just with jobs, but with the organization. And we subdivided that and said, well, what does that really mean? Our job is to not think about talent externally or internally. We're re-recruiting you or convincing you to stay on a daily basis. So everyone's within this talent ecosystem. So tactically, what does that mean? So we really wanted to define what's the angle we could own within an employee value proposition. So we really looked in our sector everyone talks about, and rightfully so, the impact on patients, et cetera. But given the bombardment of information that hits talent internally and externally, you have to find an angle that you own. So we asked and launched 2 questions. The first is, what's unique? What's differentiated? What can we own? And what attracts and retains? There actually is a very small set of criteria that defends against recruiters' calls and actually drives somebody to join. And we actually wanted to know what those criteria were. That's how we developed our employee value proposition, and we've owned that across all of our channels. And then the second thing is, in a world of digital, print is actually unexpected. So we've actually doubled down on advertising within print because it's actually a blank space. So ultimately, the question for us is how do we use this value proposition to own a connection to help self-filter out, but also the stronger our value proposition and the more retentive it is for our internal population. And we're actually disruptive by doing more print than we're doing digital. So the results, which I think are critical, are we have one of the industry's lowest turnover rates. And we have one of the industry's highest acceptance rates for our talent pools across the globe.
Thank you. Jeff, I want to ask you a different question, transition to a different question, this one along the lines of career progression for employees, transparent career progression for employees, and what does that look like? What systems and tools have you developed at Bach Financial to try to help with that issue?
So yeah, I'm Jeff Reed, BOK Financial. We're about a $50 billion financial institution headquartered in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I guess I'll say, just adding on to one comment from what already has been said, I echo all the comments. We've spent a lot of time in the early career, straight out of college, but, we've really been focused on the retirement side. And it leads into the question that you're asking me, Terry, which is, how are we promoting from within? How are you developing the people and the readiness that's associated with that? And, we've taken great pride in internal mobility. I mean, we average about 40% of our positions annually are filled internally. And really where it starts in a lot of cases was what we call discovery interviews. We really promoted several years ago this opportunity for our employees to have discovery conversations with leaders in other lines of business. Maybe it's other leaders inside of the line of business that they're currently in, because you can't just determine your next step based on someone who's in a current role or what a job description tells you or what an ad is that you've read. You really want to understand, number one, what's a day in the life? And yes, you can do testimonials and all those types of things. But as you get, to be a bigger organization, that becomes more difficult when you have hybrid and remote and those types of things. You want to make sure that you're additive into the career progression. And so the discovery opportunity is, one in which our employee doesn't need to notify their manager that they're going to reach out to another leader in another group. All they're doing is not conducting an interview. They're just informational sessions, trying to understand what the needs are, what the skills are. Do I have that knowledge, skill, and ability? If I don't, how do I get it? Is that technical training? Is it soft skills? Would you even consider someone like me that's not actually sat in that seat or a seat below that role? That provides the employee an opportunity to gain confidence in what they're doing. It provides direction in their development plan. We provide a lot of different avenues for development. We want people to own their own. We have on demand. We have boot camp type. We have leadership programs. There's lots of things that they can raise their hand for, some in which they need to be nominated for. But we have found that that's provided a lot of direction for our employees to really accelerate not only their development, but their interest. And that really has led to deeper retention for our team and really people that are excited about this being a career for them and not a job.
That's super important. And I think when we start talking about succession planning, a lot of companies, and I can speak for myself, a lot of companies, it's a great word, it's a beautiful word, but we don't know how to do succession planning, and employees don't really understand succession planning, right? And so it's a twofold challenge and issue, because people think, well, I'm going to be on the succession planning route, therefore you have to have a role for me. and people are just not leaving in droves anymore, at least in its current state. And so what does succession planning look like? Still, that shouldn't stop us from working on developing our employees and trying to retain them through growth and training programs and such, giving them experiences and opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. So that's super important. You know, we often talk about on these calls, on these panel discussions, what has worked, and what have been successful. I'm always interested, and I think a good learning opportunity for our audience is what hasn't worked, what has failed, and what did we learn from it. And so as we think about this whole issue, this challenge of recruitment, retention, engagement, recruitment, and intention, I'm interested to know what hasn't worked. So Josh, what hasn't worked for you in your organization or even in your career?
A lot of things. I think, I think those are learning opportunities. I think it's a few things to the topics, especially as people's expectations of organizations are changing. I think going back to, I would say 3 things. The first is by splitting the concept of talent internally and externally, I think we actually miss a huge opportunity. And I think what I learned early on in my career is that as we were developing the employee value proposition, we were talking about it externally, but it wasn't necessarily flowed through or true internally. So we'd build these proof points externally that sounded good, but they actually didn't drive the results we wanted internally, and similarly internally. So what didn't work is actually splitting them. What worked is putting them together and having the expectations of the market actually inform the way we're developing our talent experience. And that was the key learning. I think the second piece that what folks are talking about now is that progression is seen as up as opposed to over or potentially with novel experiences. And when you actually dig under the research, people want new learnings and new trainings than necessarily X movement. That is certainly important, but how do we actually deliver on both? And I think we went all in early on not thinking about that entire value proposition. And I think the last thing is you can't be everything to everyone. I think early on in the journey, we tried to be everything to everyone from a marketing standpoint, an attraction standpoint, et cetera. But like all things, we do some things really well, and we do some things not very well. So early on, we tried to mitigate those things. And instead, we should have just leaned into our strengths. So I think what didn't work is actually trying to cover our weaknesses as opposed to leaning into our strengths. One of our opportunities is location, right? It's a very expensive region for people to live in, et cetera. So instead of trying to change that, we actually worked on improving our strength. So kind of the both sides, but those would be 3 things that would come top of mind given the topic today.
Thank you. Dana, same question to you.
I would say one of the things that didn't work is not providing enough transparency throughout the organization. With regards to a number of different leads, but not being transparent enough about the comp strategy and the let's talk about pay transparency, right? We all know that was a huge one most recently. So I think we learned some hard lessons through how we rolled that out and how we so for the internal community, how we handled the bit of lack of transparency and could have been a lot better in how we communicated this. That is something that we consistently hear when we talk about our employee surveys, and is that we have to continue to be more transparent. And so we're definitely working on that. But I think that's something that we found didn't work. So we are, rejiggering how we internally communicate when we have these, big initiatives like that. I think what has worked is the intentionality of our culture. So we also have very, very, very high retention rates that run in, about 90%. We also have high offer acceptance rates too in the high 90s. percent, because we're very intentional. So there's a, you think intentionality and transparency would kind of go together. I think we're still bridging the transparent piece, but the intentionality of what our culture is about and our values, and that speaks volumes to the organization. And it speaks volumes to applicants too. And so we do try to weave that into the value proposition. As I mentioned before, some of the things like intrinsically giving back and so forth. But what has also really worked, and this is going to weave into diversity too, is we are very flexible workforce. So, we went into fully remote, of course, post-pandemic. We have not gone back to all office. There are some roles that we do look at location wise and office wise, if it's entry level, like sales, a sales development rep. But mostly it is a very flexible approach. And we put a lot of trust in getting goals achieved and getting business objectives achieved. You're entrusted to have more power there and have that flexibility, have that work-life balance. And that we have done very well.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the things that we also have to take into account hugely is we're all HR professionals. We have HR teams that report to us. Obviously, the audience, our audience is going to be a slew of HR professionals, but the managers have a huge role. Our managers have a huge role in ensuring the engagement, the sourcing, the recruitment, the retention protocols or programs that we put in place are actually sustainable. And I think that's one of the things that we tend to forget about. Our managers equipped to help with that process, because we can't do it all. Quite frankly, we don't want to do it all. And so, Mark, I want to ask you, how have you prepared your managers or upskilled your managers? Forget about upskilling the employees for a minute, upskilled your managers.
Yeah, great points by everybody. We also promote from within substantially. We are, being right off of Lake Ontario, I always say that we can't recruit fish. Their fish aren't going to work in a hospital or for a health system. And they're also not patients, right? So we are geographically challenged to the north of us. So we do a lot of promoting from within, and it's important to provide those new managers with the appropriate skill set as they move into these roles. We implemented business partners, which they didn't have prior to my coming here. And really having those engagement individuals get involved with the manager step by step, having them work through issues, I think has been a godsend for us. Really a high touch environment for us. There has to be a lot of face-to-face interaction. So that's really where our focus has been. I would also say that when we find challenges, which we have, it's really important that leadership's involved and being able to make decisions, whether it's the high school program that I talked about, being able to overcome obstacles on the fly. I think that's critical. And having people that can make those decisions in the room is just vitally important. If you don't have those individuals in the room and people can't make decisions, those obstacles aren't going to be overcome. And I know all of my colleagues in my external partnerships would echo that sentiment. But also making sure you have, when you bring new employees in, making sure that you have, I'll call them joy creators, people that are going to mentor them in a positive way, welcome them into the organization. That person that these new nurses these new nurses go around with have to be, positive, provide a positive experience and really help pull that person along. If they're going to be negative or disengaged, it's not going to work.
Okay, thank you. I totally agree. And I think for me at the New York Public Library, my capacity as VP of HR at the New York Public Library, management training is one of those things. Leadership training is one of those things that we've really zeroed in on for the past year and a half, and even going forward, because we realize so much is happening at that unit level. And managers have these opportunities to engage their employees, whether it's having a stay interview, having a development conversation, And we realized that they weren't as skilled at having those conversations with those employees, and those employees are walking out the door and they're saying, well, my manager never spoke to me, and that's why I left, or whatever, or the organization didn't invest in my development. Well, how do we know unless we give the managers the tools to actually have those types of conversations, and then the whole process in terms of how to make it real. One other thing, and just tying back to the tools, and I think the other thing is, we often talk about the employee experience, but there's the whole candidate experience. And I know we're doing a lot of, we've spoken about a lot of internal mobility, but there's the external mobility, but the candidate experience, quite frankly, is for internal and external. And so how have we revolutionized the candidate experience, whether it is our applicant tracking system, how we communicate to candidates, videos, whatever it may be, the tools, social media. And so, Jeff, what have you been doing in that area at BOK?
A variety of things. So, we implemented a chat bot probably about 3 or 4 years ago. Olivia is our chat bot. And when you start that off, it's minimal information because you're really kind of feeding Olivia the answers to the questions. And we're not as far along as Josh is on the EVP. In fact, we kicked off an EVP kind of creation, if you will, this month. And we, have a lot of the things that we want to refine and we want to put in there. But a lot of it is to make sure that we're telling the same story, right? That we're identifying what is it that the company wants, what is it that our talent wants, and how are we providing that information to them, so that we're being very authentic in what we're saying and how we're doing it, that we are providing them an opportunity to, have a shared purpose, have personal growth, bring that holistic well-being to the role, make deeper connections, direct their own development and career, all of those things. We need to be able to communicate that back to our candidate base. And we also identified, if I go back to, saying maybe some things that we do well versus what we didn't do well, I think historically we found situations where maybe the interview process was monumental for a candidate, right? They had 8 rounds or 15 people or whatever. And that's just, it's not feasible, whether it's in person or virtual. It's not selling the story. It's saying, hey, join BOK Financial and go through a whole lot of red tape in order to get something done. And that's not who we're about, right? So what we needed to do is to make sure the culture of our company matched our process. And so it really came down to, how do we remove, or more importantly, how do we instill or install the things that are most important to us? Making sure the right people are at the table, they're having the right conversations with the right things. We've also wanted to make sure, are we really looking for the right talent? Just because I lost Terry, who is a very talented person in a role, doesn't mean that I need to replace Terry's exact skills, right? So what are the skills that we need that are critical? Or more importantly, when we look at the inventory of skills that we have in roles that have multiple incumbents, what skills are we light on? I'd much rather go find someone who has really strong leadership or development or communication and teach them how to manufacture a widget than go hire another widget manufacturer. And we have found, once we get that story and understanding internally, it really enhances the candidate experience, because we're having conversations about the right things at the right time.
So very true. And I think, and I'm going to come to you, Josh, next, but I think I just want to say this. I think how we explain, how we articulate the role to the candidates, again, internally or externally, is super, super important. And we all have job descriptions that we post in, 15 bullet points or whatever, but it's really not telling them. It's not telling what the job is. It's not telling what they're going to accomplish or what they're expected to accomplish, so on and so forth. One of the things that we implemented at the library were, we call them impact job descriptions. And so it starts with, what are you going to teach, own, learn? What are you responsible for in those areas? And this is working with the hiring manager to develop this. And then on the job description itself, we lay out, what are you expected to accomplish in 1 month, in 3 months, in 6 months, sort of like the goals, that they really have an understanding of, what is this job that I'm applying for, that I'm interested in. The other thing that I would love to see happen is creating that a better space or a bigger space for candidates to actually interview us. We spend the typical interview, as we all know, is whether it's an hour long, 45, 50 minutes of us peppering that candidate with questions, and we give them 10 minutes to ask, and they all come with the same question typically. But so how do we reverse that a little bit or adjust that a little bit so that they know that they're getting into the right mix, right? And so that's super important. But Josh, I want to go to you with that question as well.
Yeah, and I'll merge the two together, the internal and the candidate component, because I actually think for us it's a very similar answer. So, we realize that we co-create the experience with managers. So we have a stewardship role, but also organizations have points of exhaustion, right? You can only get people to do so many things so often, and you have to get that right every time, because to every candidate or employee, the experience is unique, right? But managers actually have to deliver that over and over and over again. So the question is, how do you do that, right? So the benefit of being an organization that leads with science is we have a lot of scientists here. So we actually identify what are the few key moments. Not all moments are equivalent in a candidate process and an employee's journey. There's like 4 or 5 moments that shape the entire experience. So we actually went through a research experiment to say, what are those 4 or 5 moments that are the most differentiating? And then the next question for us is, what's the one behavior a manager has to do in order to actually maximize that experience? Then we scale that behavior through managers, the TA team, or internal. So I'll give you an example, right? So the most critical moment is the first touch point in the candidate experience. So we actually spent a ton of time giving tools to all of the people in the process to say, focus on this and do this. And then because we know all those moments, we actually measure how they're doing. And then we actually watch for points of defect, and we just fix the points of defect. So that actually gives us an overall experience where we're curating and focusing the behavior. And it's similar on the inside. So we talk about these ideas like culture. We want to deliver culture, but that's really confusing for managers. So we actually said, how is culture delivered? We actually found out it's one thing. Culture is viewed as true when a manager talks about the 5 values on a weekly basis. Okay, I can get my head around that, right? You can actually change that. So that's how we actually think about these 2 different elements is what are the moments? What are the behaviors? How do we measure those? That's point 1. Point 2 is what delivers results? And I love what everyone's talking about here as well. We have a very extensive recruitment process, and we know that candidates want a faster recruitment process. But we also know that the extensive recruitment process delivers us great yield. People feel like they can interview us, they get an accurate job preview. So instead of actually changing that, we're like, look, we really like this, but what we're going to do is tell people why we do it. So we actually increase the transparency versus reacting to the feedback to minimize the expectation gaps that occur between candidates' expectations and their experience. We've actually found that we've kept all the good stuff and reduced the noise in the overall experience by just being like, look, this is our culture, this is why we do it, and not overreacting to data points that don't necessarily get to the results that we're looking for. So that's kind of the way we build out this ecosystem.
Josh, if I could add, I mean, you speak to something that we do, we call it the level of interest curve, right? And that is, if you knew that you had a 5-step interview process in the very beginning and you sold them on the reasons why and the importance of it and how they're going to gain information and we're going to make sure that we're a better fit for each other, I totally agree with you. The experience is tremendous. It's when they don't know and they got through the second interview and they think it's the last, and then there's another, and then there's another, and then it's like, hey, where does it end? And so, that level of interest really drops tremendously, if they don't know that up front.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, I think I work with search firms I work a lot with search firms for our executive level searches, and like you can't afford for that long lull. Candidates will lose interest. They will accept another job, whatever, and we lose talent so quickly with these lengthy processes. And I understand everybody wants to have their hand in the recipe to say, I want to be a decision maker. I want to be at a certain point, we got to just make a decision. We need to identify who those decision makers are and make them front and forward.
And just on that, so again, being a data company, I don't know, this is what we always think about is we actually know the points of inflection where those moments occur, right? So in onboarding, for example, we know after day 14, the emotional curve dips. So we actually send a patient letter at day 14. But in the candidate experience, we actually implemented this thing called TLC. We know the moments where we're at highest risk of losing someone in the funnel, and we intervene with marketing at each of those moments. Because the question is do we change all of our managers, or do we manage the process with the candidate with data? And, it's harder to change an organization of managers for a variety of reasons, but actually it's easier to implement a process that actually bridges the emotional moments in the experience. And we know, up to a 6-month process where every one of those moments are, and we intervene. So there's another opportunity that can scale HR functions in a way that doesn't require you to wholesale change an organization.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mark, I know you're in a hospital, so this question may not be applicable to you, but maybe on some parts of the organization. Obviously, we're in this space of post-pandemic hybrid work, remote work, hybrid work. And I think we are all still trying to wrap our heads around just exactly how does this work and what are the systems and tools and processes we have to put in place. So as you think about if you have a hybrid workforce, remote or hybrid workforce, and I should start there, is any part of your workforce remote or hybrid?
It's very, very minimal. You're going to see it more in our coders, the people that sit behind a computer all day. Obviously, we have not gotten into from a telemedicine perspective where we have, telemedicine nurses and some providers, but it's very, very minimal. That being said, we did implement a new learning program, 360 learning, so that people could take advantage of this at home. And we also are launching another program to help our employees upskill through Workforce Edge. I don't know if you're familiar with Workforce Edge, but they're going to basically take all of our providers for educational services and certificate programs, whatever that may be, and put it all into one space where employees can go to that one space, figure out what they want to do based on the career pathing that we offer at a discounted rate, and obviously through our enhanced tuition programs. And we really believe that's going to help, everybody, whether you're remote or not. And it's free to us, by the way. Does not cost us anything because the educational providers work with Workforce Edge to
Gotcha.
pay for that. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. So Dana, do you have a hybrid or remote workforce?
Yeah, and so we're actually going through an exercise right now that ties back into that employer value proposition. My employer brand manager went out to the employees, did about 35 focus groups, which hadn't been done in about 4 years, just to find out, hey, is our culture and what we're saying out there, both externally and internally, still aligned? Especially with, you have tech, we're hyper growth up until the last year. And has this been, is this still at the core, right? And it was amazing that, yes, everybody was still believing in that. But the number one was, again, the flexibility in the workforce. So we are now having a conversation about how do we advertise this, because we don't want to define ourselves. Like, we can't say we're hybrid, because there are some people that do go into the offices depending upon the region. In EMEA, we have, in Czech Republic, in Poland, like, people go into the offices. It's very much about the community there. So regionally, there's differences. Then by certain entry-level roles, there's more encouragement to be collaborative in the office. So it's like, we can't really say we're hybrid. We can't really say we're, fully remote. We can't say. So we're now working as we speak with the CEO and his leaders, and of course, the head of HR and internal communications to bridge this into, however, we're actually using a writer to how do we want to speak to this externally, and then how do we want to speak to it internally, and we are in the thick of it right now. So, but the number one thing that came back to say is, we have to retain this flexibility. So it's again going back to, we want to trust our employees to work with their leaders, right? To make that a manageable experience for them. So if it does make sense, if you're entry level in sales or this, to come in, or, and still have the community, and, because that is the toughest part, to have the community and the full collaboration sometimes when you're fully remote. But it is a hot topic right now. So I can get back to all of you in a little bit as to how we end up totally framing that. But I think we're on the right path in how we're going to do it. But it is it's a hot topic. And it was the number one thing that when we went to talk about those moments that matter and talk about like the value proposition, it was the top thing.
And I think one of the things that's important, and this goes back to managers, is just because I have a remote team or a hybrid team, I'm still responsible for their development and growth.
Correct.
And so many managers are, lack of a better phrase, old school in their thinking that unless I see you, I don't know what you're doing, and I can't develop you, and I don't know how you're progressing. But those conversations, whether that person is remote, hybrid, on site, 5 days a week, we have to be equitable in those conversations and those opportunities for growth and development.
Yeah, and not limit diversity either, because as I mentioned, that was how we advanced a lot of we upped the numbers and bringing in more underrepresented talent by having a lot more remote workforce too. So we want to balance that as well, so that we're still attracting, top talent and underrepresented talent that may be remote fully.
Right. Jeff or Josh, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I will. I think that it's been an interesting journey, right? The pandemic forced us into a more virtual setting in a lot of instances, but it wasn't as though we didn't have remote or even hybrid or flexible environments prior to the pandemic. I think we were forced to utilize tools differently to find ways in order to communicate. We were able to, or had to, figure out how to battle through what I would call virtual fatigue. We had to develop leaders on how to keep a team, or frankly, even a one-on-one conversation engaging in terms of what they were doing and how they were doing it. And so, if you look at our organization, I would say that we do have hybrid opportunities. I mean, we have a lot of client-facing roles where, doing that from your living room is not always the best idea. And so we have mandatory, required roles that you have to be in the office. And in some groups, you have flexibility in hybrid work. But we really provided our managers with development and intentionality around activities or ways in which to conduct conversations differently. It's not all about, crucial or difficult conversation. It's about involvement, it's belonging, it's inclusion. It is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't make someone feel called out and makes them feel included and a part of the team from an inclusive perspective. So we've really put a lot of effort in that development with our leadership team. I think we're still on the journey, and we have more to do, but it's paid positive dividends so far.
Josh, anything to add?
I think for us, we have a multi-location distributed workforce. So, I think hybrid is an interesting question, but managers are already working with teams where they are not co-located. So I think we've always been investing in those skills. The only thing that I would say as it relates to workforce preferences, of which this is a very important preference that emerged out of the pandemic, is that those have strategic impacts on the business. So we really wanted to identify what were the impacts. So, where can you reduce friction, right? So we really want to understand what would keep our current employees here in their current role, given a healthcare company as well, right? Like you kind of have to be here when you're making medicines, right? Like you can't make a vial of medicine at home. You could, it probably wouldn't go too well, right? But so we want to make sure that we're doubling down on what actually retains people here. But what we actually found is what was the impact externally is that about 80% of people only look for jobs within a 60-mile radius. So they won't even consider you now if you're not within a 60-mile radius. So we're actually losing huge candidate pools who weren't even applying to us. So that was an insight. But once they applied, they actually cared about additional sets of employer preferences that we doubled down on to overcome this narrative, if you will. But then we also had to say, like, well, how do we actually stimulate this pool of 80% of people we might not even be getting to apply in order to actually influence our volumes going forward? So it's a long way to say workforce preferences change over time, but they have strategic impact, and we wanted to size that impact. But from an actual working standpoint, it didn't have huge impact on us just because we're so large now.
Excellent. Great conversation. My final question is around, and I'd be remiss if I didn't do this. Obviously, we know that DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is huge. It has been for the past couple of years. Hopefully will continue to be. And I think, we've all done, tons of organizations have done different things to make sure that they are recruiting diverse talent and retaining diverse talent. We can list ad nauseum all the different tactics, tools, strategies out there. But I want to zero in on two, maybe three dimensions of diversity. One is multi-generational, because we have first of all, the workforce is shifting quickly. I know for my workforce, the number of Gen Zers and millennials is rapidly growing. 60% of that population, 40% everybody else. And so that's a big one. And the other one is around the other dimension of diversity is accessibility and disabled persons, particularly mental health, those who have who are neurodiverse. I'll say that. And so I wanted to ask this panel, what sorts of strategies, sourcing, retention, engagement strategies have you developed centered around those particular dimensions of diversity? So I'll start with Mark.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So something we've been proactively doing is really going after that neurodiverse market. I think it's an untapped resource personally. And I think there's a lot more that we can all do there to bring in talent into our organizations. But we are partnering with some local organizations that provide services to help those individuals when they come into the workforce with coaches. It's a lot of it's grant funded for us in New York State. So we're able to leverage that and bring these coaches in. And in some cases, when we're training them, that's covered as well, their wages for a period of time. So for us, it's a huge win-win to help bring those individuals in. We have had some success and we've had some instances where it didn't work, but I think it's something that we need to keep trying. And as an organization, again, somewhat for us, it's somewhat been a newer push for us, but I believe that we need to keep focused there.
Thank you. Dana.
I would say, so couple things. We partner certainly with some organizations, so disability.in for sure on the disabled front. But we launched for the first time a partnership with Power to Fly, which is a global intersectional diversity platform, if you're not familiar with it. And it does cover off on the certainly the building the pipelines and the outreach, just between their own, obviously, database, and then, feeding that into our pipeline as well. But it also does on the career front too. So we have the ability to have two different platforms. There's the kind of recruiting platform. And then there's also the career development platform. So we partnered with our learning and development. And of course, I work very closely with our DEIB leader. So I think once a month, if not, at least once a month, they put on all kinds of insightful workshops in career development, but they also touch on the different underrepresented talent. So, I think we'll be able to capture on both sides more learnings and more takeaways on how to source and also keep talent in both of the areas that you just mentioned, between the neurodiverse and the disabled. But I think when you talk about accessibility, I'll just say real quick so that we can give others opportunity to talk. It's also about looking at our process, right? So that's also, where we're reducing biases. We have to make it accessible, right? So is our process accessible to somebody who's neurodiverse? Are they going to want to be on a panel? No. Like if they're a software engineer with neurodiverse, they're going to want to have an interview set up that's different, right? So it's looking at how we're being transparent, back to a lot of the points on saying what our process is and outlining that so that anybody who is neurodiverse or disabled can see that and decide, hey, here's somebody who's really coming out and saying what it is that the process is. And then, they can kind of make their decisions, but tweaking that and making sure that we have the accessibility in our interview and hiring process and also online that says that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll make a couple of comments here.
Go ahead.
Just start with the fact that, we're still kind of early in the journey, but what we identified is that we already employ several of these groups of people, right?
Absolutely.
And they got through the interview process and accepted the job. And maybe these were some of their own individual challenges that they're trying to overcome. And I wouldn't say that we've turned a blind eye over the years, but we weren't intentional around what are the things that we could be doing or should be doing in order to provide better accessibility or better support or really listening to them on what are their needs? What are the things that we could do to make this a better environment for them to excel and to succeed? And so we've really started kind of the conversation, probably a little further than starting the conversation, but really having the conversation around what are those things? How can we do that? How can we better identify those? How can we have a greater impact here and create an environment really before we go out and talk to all these organizations and look to bring in other, people? Let's make the changes to our environment if that's what we need to do. Probably not similar to our culture, but really be more understanding around what that is and realizing that a job that they may need to do may not fully fit a job the way that we do it today. And so could we change that job a little bit and move some of the responsibilities into a different role that would have put us in a better position to attract someone who might be, whether it's neurodiverse or in some of these other areas. And so that's probably where we are, still early in the journey, but part of it is having the conversation and understanding what changes need to take place.
Exactly. Josh, anything to add?
Yeah, I think yes, and right. So I think the question for us is how do we integrate DE&I into our business practices? So we united it under 3 pillars: better workplace, better science, and better world. So we really wanted to start out and say, how do we integrate the needs of different groups in the way we do science, which is really important. And then from that, the next question is how do we bring groups of individuals together within the organization to advocate for these points of view so the organization could learn both in terms of listening, but also from a policy standpoint. So we scaled our employee resource groups to really build out under this better workplace pillar, like what is our aspiration here? And then again, the benefit of me being on the inside and outside is we're able to use those truths within the organization and engage in conversations externally with a variety of communities, but we knew it wasn't just marketing, it was based on what we were actually building inside. So that's kind of the way we've approached it. How does this integrate with our business? how do we learn from our employees, and then how do we talk to people about it? And we do publish our aspirations in this space and our results transparently. So we have an annual communication that goes out that's available for folks to see externally. And we find that this integration is very, very helpful.
I agree. And I think, look, I think the key here is how do we build this culture of trust so that people feel comfortable? We have to just create the space that we ask these questions, but also create the space that they feel comfortable telling us what they need, whether it's accommodation, what have you, whether it's a member of our disabled population, neurodiverse population, member of a racial, from a race perspective, or from a generational perspective. Any of the dimensions of diversity, creating that space for honest conversations where they feel that they can trust that we're going to be responsive to what they need, and also how we develop their growth, because their growth throughout the organization or throughout their career is just as important as anybody else's, point blank. This has been an exciting conversation. I think one of the ideas is us learning. Obviously, we're having this conversation to educate the audience, but also just us learning from each other, which is always critical. And so thank you all for your time here. I think the other key here is that there is no perfect solution. You just got to try, launch and learn. What works for this company may not work for this company, may work for that company. That's fine. But the one thing we can't do is just remain static and not try different things, because our employees will tell us what's not working. And so we're going to try and get ahead of that, but also engage them as much as possible, our stakeholders as much as possible. So again, thank you very much for your time, for your insights today. Very helpful. I would say to the audience, if there are any questions that can be answered that we didn't answer through this conversation, please feel free to submit them through the Connex community, or feel free to email our partners at Connex directly. Thank you, everyone.